therapy from the beginning, right, as opposed to trying to change people later on. All right, okay, so what else have I got here? Okay, we operate a group called For At-Risk Youth that is focused on family reunification. One of our program outcomes is resilience related. Inquiring whether resilience has been developed, strengthened. So that's what they want to ascertain. Would there be a way to communicate the relationship between the ORS and SRS outcomes and what it says about capacity to sustain change over long periods of time post-intervention? And I'm assuming, we're also looking at what's the correlation in resilience and scores on the measure.
Okay, so essentially the ORS is a measure of client well-being or an estimate of their functioning. And there is some confusion about why we're measuring that as opposed to something else. And it reflects a shift, a fundamental shift in the paradigm that guides the work. I was trained within a medical model or medical perspective. The way I was taught to work was I find out the client's diagnosis, I then pick the appropriate method, the method that contains the ingredients specifically remedial to the problem or the diagnosis the client has. If I follow the protocol faithfully, then the best chances of an outcome will follow. My own read of the research that we reviewed in The Heart and Soul of Change, 2 editions, and a host of meta-analyses that we published was that idea, while interesting, it isn't really supported by the evidence about psychotherapy. So where are we left? We're left with what Bruce Wampold started to talk about back in the early 90s, something called the contextual model. And that is the client's problem and the treatment for that problem aren't the most essential ingredients, but rather the participants and the context in which they work. So there's a fundamental shift from the medical perspective. I'm going to want to measure change in symptoms. Are the client's symptoms going away? Because then that's a sign that the treatment is successful. We're going to come back to that in a minute. From a contextual perspective, the real question is this relationship, this pairing of this client and clinician working? Most clinicians can understand this intuitively because they know that oftentimes the work failure has to do with something not being right in the mix between them and the client. When you think about our work actually, taking virtually everybody who comes through the door, the overall efficacy of psychotherapy is just friggin' amazing that it works that often given the variables involved here. So you've got 2 people, and the question really is this working for this client? How are we going to know that? Well, instead of measuring adherence to the protocol and the medical model, instead we're going to measure the fit between what the therapist has to do and the client's level of engagement. Is the client engaged in what I'm saying? If they are, well, engagement lends itself to better outcomes. What kinds of outcomes are we thinking about? What I want as a fit practitioner are outcomes that predict when the client will enter treatment. They'll decide, geez, I need help. And secondly, when they'll decide, I've had enough help. And here's the curious part. Symptoms don't do that. People's level of symptomatology, and again, most therapists will sense this intuitively. Generally speaking, clients' level of symptoms does not predict when they decide, I think I need help. In fact, that very fact drives our field crazy. We have things like National Depression Awareness Day in the United States, as if people aren't aware that they're depressed. It's kind of crazy. But the assumption is, well, they must not know they're depressed, otherwise they would show up. No. People don't go to treatment because of their symptoms. For the most part, they go, and here's the twist, when their symptoms affect their functioning or well-being. This is a revolutionary thought because it shifts you into the contextual model. And it turns out clients' estimates of their functioning or well-being are fairly good predictors of when they decide, I need help. And improvements in their well-being is a pretty good predictor of when they decide, you know what, I think I'm done. I don't think I need any more help. So all that's a very long way around to this question that was asked, because there are any and all sorts of variables you could measure. You can measure resilience, a whole host of things. I'm interested in well-being because of what it predicts in terms of accessing services. Now the question is what predicts whether or not clients maintain change over time? And so I've drawn a little picture here, and see if you can see it on the camera. Because here's what the data say that I think is so very interesting about maintenance of change. So if this is a typical recovery curve here, and you have clients getting better over time, wherever the client terminates or stops, let me draw a little mark here, wherever the client terminates or stops, the research literature indicates that is about where they will be 18 months to 2 years later. So if you stop here, you are likely to be here, and the correlation between these 2 points is about 0.7 to 0.9 depending on the study. Now, if you're trying to think about how to help clients maintain change, this graph should give you an idea about how to do it. And that is, first off, you want to keep clients engaged for as long as they want if you're helping them. Because if you stop, let's see, over here, then that's where they will be 18 months later. If they stop over here, then that's where they will be. But as change begins to slow down, I have to see them every single week. I can begin to dose the treatment and intensity of treatment. I can begin to spread it out so that I'm not seeing them as often. Of course, all of this is done in collaboration with the client. But the main key thing to think about is how far along up this curve can I get them before we stop or we begin to spread out the contacts. I like to call this the dental model of treatment planning rather than the medical model. In a medical model, what you do is you diagnose the offending part and you cut it out. You create surgery. You take out the cancer. This is the metaphor that's guided mental health services for much of it. We're going to remove your anxiety disorder, your phobia, your depression. We're just going to remove it. And I just don't think that's the way it works. When you go to the dentist, and they do some work, either a cleaning or they address a cavity, maybe they put a crown on a tooth, they don't say, never come back. Don't ever come back, because that's a sign of failure if you ever come back. This is the goofiness of the model. So when people will sometimes say to me, well, how successful is psychotherapy? I said, it depends what you mean. Each course of psychotherapy has an outcome, but I think it's really nice if clients decide to return to a therapist every so often and say, either I've sort of fallen off on what we had made progress about last time, or I want to move on to something else. I just think this makes sense. So I hope that addresses the question of how can we help clients maintain the change. And you know from experience right in BC that when I come in to do some training in FIT, and I won't mention the organization because I didn't ask for their permission, but when I came in and I said, they said they wanted to implement FIT, I said, fine, you have to remove all session limits. And just, oh my God, we can't do that. We can't remove session limits. Clients will come forever. No, you are going to use the feedback to identify the clients you're not helping and either do something different or get them to somebody else. And with the clients you are helping, you can keep them for a few sessions more, and it costs you very little. Because the real expense in mental health services, the largest expense, is this 20 to 30% of people who end up eating up 70 to 80% of the resources. They stick around and they just don't experience a benefit from the change.
Yeah, no, that's powerful, Scott. How the measures can be used in that way, as opposed to, just creating an arbitrary cutoff, right? Treating everybody.
And I think the idea, you can hear the theorizing in the question. I'm not against theorizing, but the theory is that, well, maybe if they were more resilient, or we help them build more resilient, then they won't need us very much. This isn't an idea that makes any sense to me. People's well-being is going to go up and down, dependent on a lot of factors, including the crazy stuff that's happening in the world around us. And think about this. much of the emerging evidence about depression that I think is really interesting, it's not finished yet, but it's really interesting, is maybe depression isn't in here. Maybe depression is in the world in which I'm living, the crap world where I make very little money, where I have a hard time month to month paying my rent, where my partner doesn't love me. Maybe that's the reason we have high levels. I don't have a sense of purpose or meaning because the world doesn't give me that. Maybe it's not between our ears. Maybe it's in the interaction, and well-being gives us a hint of that. And it simply says, when you experience that dip, pick up the phone. That's where we're here. That's why we're here.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. I saw a lot of head nodding too.
Can I jump in with one observation? Is that okay, Cindy?
Sure, David.
Oh, sure. Which is, as I'm listening to the thread of the conversation from Heidi Brotland and these people with severe distress through juvenile residential treatment and where depression is, really speaks to the whole notion of developing deep domain-specific knowledge. And that piece of it really takes time if you're going to be helpful on a client-by-client basis. Am I off base or missing anything?
No, I don't think so. I think that it makes perfect sense. And one thing about the measures, if you shift over to the whole idea of the Better Results book and campaign, is that when we began measuring the outcomes of the clinicians around the world, and at the time, I think we had a database of about 25,000 therapists and 250,000 sessions, we suddenly started noticing something curious and disconcerting. And that was certain therapists in the sample had reliably better outcomes than others. And initially I thought, well, this was some chance variable. Every stock rises and falls. It's just some chance thing. It's a random walk. But these therapists, curiously, were good every year, year after year, most of them. And secondly, it didn't matter who they saw. Adults, children, alcohol problems, mental health problems, a combination of both. And of course, we really wanted to know, how did this happen? And I was completely baffled. We watched videos of these people work, no clue to us how they were doing it. And it wasn't until we stumbled on the work of Anders Ericsson and this whole notion of deliberate practice that we really started to understand the difference. And these folks, these top performers, spent much more time at the edge of their performance, pushing their knowledge to that edge. They weren't interested in when they were successful. They were interested and curious and leaned in when they weren't successful. And that is connected to what you're saying, David, because what that helped them do was develop more complex cognitive representations of this knowledge about how to make a difference in the lives of people. And right now, as a team, that's what we're mapping. We're mapping how can we help therapists develop more complex, individual therapists develop more complex representation of their knowledge so that they have more choices when they meet with their clients.
Okay, so we need to wrap up, Scott. I'm not going to ask you any more questions.
Oh, shoot.
Let's talk about the book.
Okay.
I do have a question. I thought there was going to be an audio version of the book. And do we have a date that the hard copy is coming out, or the paperback copy?
The copies, it's a paperback, is supposed to be released on May 26th. That's what APA has told us. They've been really pretty good about meeting all of the deadlines so far. We went back and forth with them beginning in October about an audio version. They did some exploration. Believe it or not, they have never done an audiobook. They're doing electronic chapters and such, but they hadn't done so we went back and forth, and as of the end of March, they had given the rights back to us to create an audio version. So we probably won't have that until the end of summer. So Daryl, myself, and Mark will be creating the audiobook, and we'll let people know. But right now, it's only available in a print copy. And if you pre-order the book, then we have been putting people on an insiders list and sending them chapters from the book so that they can read it ahead of time.
Great. Okay, Thank you so much, Scott. Thanks everyone else for joining. Hey, Arnold, nice to see you. Haven't seen you in a while. Okay, everybody. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks everybody for joining in.